We are this Sunday in the fourth week of our Easter message series we're calling Possible, and the fourth week also of the season of Easter. As a church, as we've discussed previous weeks, we continue to celebrate the resurrection of our Lord throughout April and into May. Easter, in our experience and in our memories and in reality for us in ordinary times, tends to be a cheery time of the year. Winter yields finally to spring, and we experience the full freshness of the season, the smell of cut grass, the sound of kids playing outside, the sight of flowers blooming and coming forth from the ground. And today, this Sunday, especially fits that profile, such a beautiful day. So we might be tempted on first response to think of it as just another beautiful spring day in the season of Easter, much as we've experienced in years past. But sadly, as we know, that's not quite true, because this Easter is a little bit different. We live in a very uncertain time in the shadow of COVID-19, this virus. We don't know exactly how we should be acting, what we should be doing. We know right now that we're beginning at least to see over the horizon the emergence from the limitations that have been placed on us, but we're still uncertain about what that might mean. So uncertainty still walks with us. And in a way, this whole experience that we have been having, and that we will probably be having for a while, is very much like the experience of that first Easter season. The apostles and the early followers of Jesus did not wake up on Easter morning filled with confidence and hope for the future, whatever the weather might have been on that day. Instead, they were filled with fear, doubt, and uncertainty. Their world had been rocked with Jesus' death on the cross. Their hopes and dreams for the future, and they certainly had them, those hopes and dreams for the future were, so far as they knew, sealed with Jesus in the tomb. So they were unsettled and disquieted, uncertain, much as we are today. They did not know what their future held. But that mood changed over the course of that first Easter season. Over a period of about 40 days, their spirits lifted. They discovered the empty tomb and interacted with the risen Jesus, and their mood and their perspective on life changed completely. As they came to faith in the risen Jesus, they discovered a renewed sense of hope and confidence in the future. Our goal for this series is that the same thing might happen for you. For the first 2 weeks, we looked primarily at coming to faith in the resurrection. Last week, we focused on hope. Hope, we said, is faith looking forward. Hope is the confident expectation that goodness is coming to us. Last week, we talked about 3 degrees of hope: casual hope, precious hope, and ultimate hope. And we gave you an exercise. We asked you to try to make a list of what you might be hoping for coming out of this crisis, the things that are your hopes. Today, I want to encourage you to add to your list a very specific hope that may not have made it onto the list that you made, but it should have. It should have been on your list, because this one hope, if fulfilled, unlocks all other hope. Now, as I say that, please know that I'm not scolding you, because for a long time, I wasn't really thinking about this particular hope either. This hope that you and I should share. I just didn't think about it. Now I see it, and the gospel that we just heard from the 10th chapter of John makes it even more clear to me, and I hope to you. In that gospel, Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees and other religious leaders. In his speech, he uses imagery that would have been familiar to them, that of a shepherd. He also describes a scene that they would have been aware of, a very realistic, everyday scene. At the end of the day, shepherds would bring their sheep into a sheepfold where several herds of sheep would be kept. A sheepfold was an enclosure with stone walls that protected sheep from thieves or wild animals looking for prey. A guard would be stationed at the entrance of the gate, both to protect the sheep and to keep the sheep in the enclosure. Here's what our gospel said. Jesus said, "Very truly I tell you, anyone who does not enter the sheepfold by the gate, but climbs in another way, is a thief and a bandit. So Jesus says that a robber or thief does not enter the sheepfold through the gate, but climbs over the wall to steal the sheep. He continues, the one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. At night, shepherds would put their sheep in a sheep pen. Then in the morning, they would come to collect them. The shepherd of the sheep would be recognizable to the guard, so he would let him in. Once the shepherd enters the sheepfold, he calls out to his sheep. He would have a special call for his sheep. The sheep knew the voice of the shepherd. They heard it every single day, so they became accustomed to that voice. So when they heard the call of the shepherd, they would follow him. The shepherd knew each sheep personally. Of course, to any casual observer, all the sheep would seem the same. But the good shepherd knew each sheep personally and had given each sheep a name. The shepherd would then lead them out of the pen and into the fields. There are certain voices that you recognize. They bring us comfort and security. As a kid, you recognize the voice of your parents. Maybe you can remember a time when, as a child, you were separated from your parents at the supermarket, at the mall, wherever it might be. You were separated from them. You were scared and alone. And then you heard the voice of your parents calling out for you, and you knew it would be okay. Now you are older, and perhaps it might be the voice of your spouse or a good friend. When you hear their voice and their greeting, you perk up. It just brings joy to your heart. In the same way, hearing your name also gets your attention. The sweetest sound to each one of us is the sound of our own name. We especially love hearing that our name said in a place where we feel alone or on our own. It is that feeling of being at a party where you don't know anyone and you feel out of place, and then you hear a friendly voice call out your name. There is joy in knowing that someone knows you and is glad that you are there. Jesus says that he knows the name of his sheep. He calls his sheep, his people, his followers. He calls them by name. He knows them well. He continues the analogy, this figure of speech of which the gospel speaks. When he has brought out all of his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. The shepherd would lead them out of the pen to go about their day. He would lead them out of the pen and provide direction, protection, and provision. Shepherds would lead the sheep in the right direction and protect them from wild animals and lead them to places of provision, food, water, and rest. Notice what Jesus says about the shepherd. The shepherd walks ahead of the sheep. He does not walk behind them, but ahead of them. He leads them to places of provision. The very word leadership is developed from the shepherd imagery, where the shepherd goes ahead of the flock and encounters the problems of the flock first. The shepherd goes ahead of the sheep and scouts out problems. The problem might be an attack from wild animals. The problem might be the possibility of taking a wrong turn that would have led the sheep falling off a cliff. In the Middle Eastern desert, all the terrain looked the same, so it could be easy for the sheep to take a wrong turn. The shepherd goes before, so he knows what is coming. Do you know that Jesus has already been to your future? He walks ahead of you. Your future is not a surprise to him. He walks ahead of you. He knows the wrong turns and the cliffs you need to avoid. He sees the things that are going to attack your heart, your mind. He knows the events that are going to fill you with fear or concern or worry. He knows the pitfalls and the problems. But he also knows the places of provision. He knows places where you can find nourishment for your heart, your soul, your mind, your body. He walks ahead of you and wants to bring you to a place of provision. Jesus continues the analogy. They will not follow a stranger, but they will run from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. Now, sheep are just plain dumb, okay? I grew up on a farm. We didn't have sheep, but my uncles did, and sheep are not that bright. They're not intelligent animals. We use it, in fact, as a criticism when we call someone a sheep. It means they can't think for themselves. Sheep are simple animals. But they are smart enough. They are smart enough not to follow the voice of the stranger. While they follow the voice of the shepherd who cares for them and meets their needs, they run from the voice of strangers. People often, or generally, follow the voices that are familiar to them. You follow the voice you recognize, sometimes whether it can help you or not. Have you ever walked in on a friend or a family member or a teenager listening to someone, perhaps a YouTuber, a radio talk show host, or a news station, and immediately it just grated on you? Instantly, you were annoyed and maybe even concerned about who they were listening to. And you even thought that that voice might be leading your friend or family member to a bad place. You could see so clearly that they were leading the person into fear or bitterness or anger, things that were not good. Have you ever thought about yourself in that way? Are there some voices that you listen to because they're familiar to you? But if you step back and evaluated them, you would admit they are not filling you with hope and confidence in the future, but with fear, anxiety, and worry. Jesus says his sheep listen to his voice, and they don't follow another. Now we're going to skip ahead and look at just one more verse before wrapping up. Jesus says, "The thief comes only to kill and destroy. I came that they might have life and have it abundantly." Jesus contrasts himself with a thief. There are thieves out there who are looking to steal your joy and peace of mind. They don't lead you to nourishment. They lead you to worry, fear, anxiety, distrust, perhaps even discord among you and those you love. They kill and destroy your future and your relationships. When you listen to those voices, they rob you of life. Jesus said he came that you might have life and have it more abundantly. As you listen to the voice of Jesus, he leads you to abundant peace, abundant joy, abundant confidence in the future. So here's the one hope that we should all have during this time and all times. The hope to grow in our intimacy with Jesus, to draw close to him so that we can hear his voice, the voice of our shepherd. If we learn to better hear and discern the voice of Jesus, the Good Shepherd, he will lead us to a place of provision. If we learn to hear his voice, we know we will have a future full of hope, because he is the Good Shepherd who has already laid his life down for us. He is the Good Shepherd who goes before us. Jesus has the words of an eternal and abundant life. His words bring life. This does not mean that his words are always easy to hear. Sometimes they are challenging, especially if we have wandered off course. Jesus wants to protect us. The abundant life comes from listening to the voice of Jesus, becoming more and more familiar with his voice, so we follow him and not the voice of strangers who do not have our good in mind. They have their own priorities, and we are not among them. There are 3 steps we can take to learn to better hear Jesus' voice. These steps are simple, but they are not something that we can do once and then that's it, we're done. They are not set it and forget it. We need to come back to them over and over again, these 3 things. The first is to ask Jesus to let you hear his voice. We have to want to hear from Jesus enough that we ask him to speak to us. Jesus respects our free will and autonomy. He wants to speak to us, but we have to ask to hear his voice. We have to invite his voice and him into our lives. So ask Jesus to hear his voice. That's the first. Second, turn down the noise. You need some space and some silence to encounter Jesus. It's impossible to hear him if you have all this other noise going on in your life. Jesus does not talk to us out loud, but in our hearts. The only way we can hear him is having quiet time and periods of silence. And you may find as you do that, that quiet time will also bear fruit at other times in your life, even in busy and noisy times. It will allow you to hear the Lord when and where you didn't even think it was possible, when and where you didn't even think he had anything to say. So create some space, some silence, some time for the Lord. It's the second thing. The third key to hearing Jesus' voice is to read the Gospels. The Gospels give us Jesus' words, his voice. They tell us what he said. And Jesus has some specific words in those Gospels for you. He knows your name and knows you personally. But in order for you to hear what he has to say with you, you must become familiar with the Gospels. You recognize the voice of a loved one because you know how they speak and the words they use, as well as their tone of voice. You will recognize Jesus' voice if you become more familiar with the words he used and how he interacted with people in the Gospels. So this week, start reading through one of the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Just choose one of them and start to read. Start to hear Jesus' voice. Pay attention as you read to how he addresses people. Imagine, if you will, the tone of voice he used to speak to them in this particular situation or another. I'm going to close here with the words of the 23rd Psalm. We've heard them once, but maybe I think it would be good for us to hear those words again. Maybe you really need to hear them today. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. And I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long.